Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The radio crackled to life at 2:47 p.m. on October 15, 2019. Interrupting what had been a relatively peaceful Tuesday afternoon. I was Vincent Russo, 34 years old at the time, and had been working as a game warden for the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for nearly 9 years. I was sitting in my patrol truck outside a local diner, finishing up paperwork from a morning citation when dispatch's voice cut through the static. Unit 47, we have a report of illegal discharge of firearm. Suspect was shooting at deer from a blue pickup truck on Clearwater Ridge Road, approximately 3 miles south of the Riverside intersection. Homeowner witnessed the incident and reports the vehicle fled southbound. I keyed the mic, my coffee growing cold in the cup holder. Unit 47 responding, ETA 15 minutes. The autumn air was crisp as I pulled onto Clearwater Ridge Road, the aspens showing their golden colors against the backdrop of dark evergreens. It was the kind of afternoon that usually made me grateful for my job, until it didn't. The road wound through dense forest, broken occasionally by large properties carved out of the wilderness. These were the homes of people who'd moved here for privacy, for the solitude that only Montana could offer. As I approached the reported location, I spotted the house immediately. It was a sprawling log structure set back from the road, with a massive lawn that gradually transitioned into thick woodland. The property screamed money, probably some tech executive or retired surgeon who'd bought their slice of paradise. I pulled over and radioed for backup, standard procedure for any investigation involving firearms. 10 minutes later, Ranger Bobby Kowalski arrived in his own patrol vehicle. Bobby was a veteran with 23 years on the force, a man who'd seen enough poaching incidents to fill a book. His weathered face and steady demeanor made him the perfect partner for situations like this. We'd worked together dozens of times, and I trusted his judgment completely. "What have we got, Vince?" Bobby asked as he stepped out of his truck, adjusting his gear belt. "Shots fired from a blue pickup. Target was deer on private property. Homeowner called it in." I gestured toward the house. "Figure we should canvass the area first, see if we can find any evidence before we knock on doors." The shoulder of the road was soft dirt and gravel, perfect for holding evidence. We walked slowly along the edge, our eyes scanning for shell casings, tire tracks, anything that might tell us what happened here. The October sun filtered through the canopy above, creating dancing shadows that made our search both easier and harder. Bobby found it first. "Here," he called, crouching down near a patch of disturbed earth. Fresh 30-06 casing still warm. I walked over and examined the brass shell. It gleamed in the afternoon light, and when I touched it with the back of my hand, I could feel the residual heat from being fired. The placement told us everything. The shooter had indeed been positioned on the road shoulder, firing toward the property. Textbook poaching behavior. "I'll document this," I said, pulling out my phone to photograph the evidence. "You want to talk to the homeowner?" Bobby nodded and headed toward the house while I bagged the shell casing and began looking for additional evidence. The trajectory of the shot would have carried the bullet toward the large lawn and into the tree line beyond. If the deer had been hit, there might be blood, fur, or other signs of impact. I worked my way methodically across the lawn, my eyes scanning the grass for any disturbance. The property was immaculate, clearly maintained by professional landscapers. But as I approached the edge where manicured grass gave way to wild forest, something caught my attention, a dark stain on the bark of a large oak tree about chest high. Moving closer, I could see the fresh scar in the wood where a high-powered rifle bullet had struck. The impact was clean and deep, the kind of mark that spoke to significant velocity and stopping power. I photographed the damage from multiple angles, making note of the height and angle for our report. But it was what I found at the base of the tree that made my stomach tighten. Dark droplets spattered the fallen leaves, blood, still wet enough to glisten in the dappled sunlight. The deer had been hit after all. Following a blood trail is something every game warden learns early in their career. Wounded animals leave signatures in their wake, droplets of blood, disturbed vegetation, tracks that show injury or distress. This trail was different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly why at first. The blood drops were larger than I'd expected from a deer, even a large buck. They seemed to hit the ground with more force, creating splatter patterns that suggested significant volume. But what really caught my attention was the spacing between drops. The stride length was enormous, far longer than any deer I'd tracked. I documented each major blood drop with my phone, following the trail as it led deeper into the forest. The terrain began to rise, a gentle slope at first that quickly steepened into a proper ridge. The trees grew thicker here, creating a canopy so dense that the afternoon light barely penetrated. Pine needles and fallen leaves muffled my footsteps as I climbed. The blood trail continued up the ridge, but the drops were becoming more sparse. Either the animal was bleeding less or it was moving faster despite its injury. Both possibilities were troubling in their own way. A wounded deer that stops bleeding might survive, but it also might be dying slowly somewhere in these woods. A wounded deer that speeds up despite blood loss was showing signs of panic or desperation. I reached the crest of the ridge and paused to catch my breath. The view beyond was striking. A narrow gully cut through the landscape like a scar, its bottom choked with thick brush and fallen timber. During spring runoff or heavy storms, this would be a rushing waterway. Now, in the dry autumn, it was a corridor of tangled vegetation stretching off into the distance. The blood trail had vanished completely. I spent several minutes combing the area around the ridgeline, looking for any sign of where the wounded animal might have gone. The ground here was rocky and covered with a thick mat of pine needles that wouldn't hold tracks well. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, I decided to take a different approach. Standing still, I listened. The forest around me was alive with small sounds. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a crow, the scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. Movement. Deliberate movement through the brush down in the gully, coming from somewhere to my right. My first thought was relief. The deer was still mobile, which meant it might survive its wound if the bullet had passed through muscle, rather than hitting vital organs. I'd be able to assess its condition and decide whether it needed to be put down humanely, or could be left to heal naturally. Was about to call out to announce my presence, standard procedure when tracking potentially dangerous wounded animals, when the wind shifted. The smell that hit me nearly made me retch. It wasn't the smell of blood or even fresh death. This was something far worse. The overwhelming stench of advanced decomposition mixed with other odors I recognized from crime scenes I'd assisted with over the years. The smell of human waste, of infection, of things that should be buried deep underground. My hand instinctively moved to the radio on my belt, though I wasn't sure what I'd report. The movement in the gully was getting closer, and the stench was growing stronger. Whatever was making its way through the brush wasn't trying to be quiet. I could hear branches snapping, the scrape of something being dragged across rocks and fallen logs. The sounds were wrong somehow, not the careful steps of an injured deer picking its way through dense cover, but something far more careless and heavy. I remained motionless on the ridge, every instinct telling me to stay hidden while my curiosity warred with a growing sense of dread. Through the gaps in the trees, I began to catch glimpses of movement. Dark shapes shifting between the trunks, too brief and fragmented to make sense of. The thing that emerged from the deeper woods was not a deer. At first, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. The shape was wrong, the size impossible, the very existence of such a creature contrary to everything I knew about the natural world. But as it moved closer, passing between the widely spaced trees in the gully, the details became unavoidable. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to span half the width of the narrow ravine. The entire form was covered in dark brown hair, but not the clean, healthy fur of a living animal. This hair was matted and patchy, hanging in clumps from frame that moved with an awkward, shambling gait. The face was the worst part. As it turned slightly in my direction, I got a clear view of features that belonged in a nightmare. The bone structure was massive and primitive, like something from a museum display of early human evolution. But where there should have been intelligent eyes, I saw only horror. The left eye socket was completely empty, just a dark hollow that seemed to stare at nothing. The right eye was intact but clouded completely white, the kind of milky opacity I'd seen in animals dead for days. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. Part of the lower lip appeared to be missing entirely, giving the face a lopsided, grotesque appearance. But it was the body that made me understand this thing was not alive, despite the fact that it was walking. The torso showed massive trauma, deep gashes that revealed gray muscle tissue beneath. The wounds were old, with edges that had dried and darkened rather than healed. These weren't fresh injuries from the rifle shot I'd been tracking. The abdomen was largely gone. What remained of the chest cavity yawned open, and I could see desiccated organs hanging loose inside. Intestines dangled from the right side of the torso like grotesque party streamers, swaying with each labored step. The smell that accompanied this vision was indescribable. Every breath I took made me fight the urge to vomit. The left leg bore a massive wound on the outer thigh, a chunk of flesh and muscle simply absent, leaving a crater that should have made walking impossible. But somehow this thing continued to move, dragging itself forward with determination that defied all logic. The right foot was completely gone. Where there should have been toes and a heel, there was only the blunt end of an ankle bone worn smooth from contact with rocks and dirt. The creature was literally walking on its own skeletal remains, each step producing a wet, grinding sound that carried clearly through the still air. I had stopped breathing entirely, afraid that even the smallest sound might draw its attention. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps this was some kind of elaborate hoax, a movie prop that had been abandoned in the woods. But the smell was too real, too overwhelming to be anything artificial. And the way it moved, the casual indifference to injuries that should have been instantly fatal, spoke to something far beyond human understanding. The creature continued its shambling progress down the gully, following some path or purpose I couldn't comprehend. It moved with the aimless determination of something operating on instinct alone, like a wind-up toy that had been set in motion and couldn't stop. Each step was deliberate but uncoordinated, as if the connection between mind and body had been severed, but the motor functions continued anyway. I watched in horrified fascination as it gradually disappeared into the deeper woods, the sound of its passage fading until only the smell remained. Even after I could no longer see it, the stench lingered in the air like a presence, a reminder that what I'd witnessed was undeniably real. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I remained frozen on that ridge, my mind struggling to process what I'd witnessed. Every rational thought told me that what I'd seen was impossible. Dead things don't walk. They don't pursue mysterious purposes through mountain forests. They don't exist in a state between life and death that defies every law of nature I'd ever learned. But the evidence of my senses was overwhelming. The smell still hung in the air around me, a mixture of decay and corruption that no amount of imagination could conjure. My eyes had recorded details with crystal clarity. The empty eye socket, the missing flesh, the impossible locomotion of something that should have been motionless in a grave somewhere. As the immediate shock began to wear off, other sensations crept in. The October air suddenly felt colder against my skin. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper and more threatening. Every small sound in the forest around me, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me jump with adrenaline-fueled terror. I needed to get back to Bobby. I needed to get back to civilization, to radio communication, to the world of logical explanations and rational responses. But I also needed to move carefully. The thing I'd seen had disappeared deeper into the woods, but I had no idea where it was headed, or if it might circle back. Forcing myself to move slowly and quietly, I began retracing my path down the ridge. Every step felt exposed, vulnerable. The trees that had seemed like peaceful wilderness 20 minutes ago now felt like potential hiding places for horrors I couldn't imagine. My hand rested on the grip of my service weapon, though I had serious doubts about whether bullets would have any effect on something that was already dead. The descent seemed to take forever. I found myself pausing after every few steps, listening for any sign that I was being followed. The normal sounds of the forest had returned, birds calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, but they felt different now, as if the entire ecosystem was on edge. When I finally reached the bottom of the ridge and stepped back onto the manicured lawn of the property, the relief was overwhelming. The sight of Bobby's patrol vehicle parked on the road shoulder was like a beacon of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Bobby was standing by the oak tree where I'd found the bullet impact, examining the damaged bark with professional interest. He looked up as I approached, and I could see his expression change immediately. Years of law enforcement experience had taught him to read faces, and mine must have been telling a story he didn't like. "Find something?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I opened my mouth to answer and found I had no idea what to say. How do you explain the impossible? How do you tell a respected colleague, a man who's seen everything the Montana wilderness has to offer, that you've just witnessed something that shouldn't exist? "Had a scare in the woods," I managed, using our standard phrase for encounters with the unexplained. Bobby studied my face for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. He'd been a game warden long enough to know that the wilderness held secrets, that sometimes officers encountered things that defied easy explanation. The unofficial policy was simple. If it didn't threaten public safety, you filed it away as one of those stories you told around campfires. The homeowner didn't see much, Bobby said, steering the conversation back to familiar territory. Heard the shot, looked out the window in time to see a blue pickup driving away fast. Didn't get a plate number, but said it looked like an older Ford, maybe early 2000s. I nodded, grateful for the return to normal police work. Found the bullet impact in that oak. Looks like a clean miss on whatever they were shooting at. It was a lie, of course. The thing I'd seen in the woods bore wounds that could have come from a dozen different sources, but I was certain none of them were from today's hunting incident. Whatever had happened to create that creature, it had occurred long before some poacher decided to take an illegal shot at deer from the roadside. "You okay, Vince?" Bobby asked quietly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The choice of words made me shudder involuntarily. A ghost would have been easy to explain compared to what I'd actually encountered. Ghosts were supposed to be translucent, ethereal, confined to old houses and ancient graveyards. They didn't shamble through mountain forests with intestines hanging from their rib cages. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. "Just need some water?" I walked back to my patrol truck and pulled a bottle of water from the cooler I kept in the back seat. The first sip tasted like salvation, washing away the residual flavor of decay that seemed to cling to my mouth and throat. I drank the entire bottle without stopping, then opened another. Bobby finished documenting the bullet impact and collecting additional evidence while I tried to regain my composure. We spent another 30 minutes canvassing the area, looking for tire tracks or other signs that might help identify the shooter. It was routine work, the kind of investigation I'd conducted hundreds of times before, but my heart wasn't in it. Every time I looked toward the tree line, I found myself searching for signs of movement. Every shift in the wind made me tense, waiting for that horrible smell to return. The knowledge that something impossible was out there, wandering through the same forests I patrolled daily, had fundamentally changed my relationship with the wilderness I'd devoted my career to protecting. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I sat in my small apartment on the outskirts of Helena, nursing a beer and staring at my laptop screen, trying to find some rational explanation for the creature I'd encountered. My initial searches yielded the usual collection of Bigfoot sightings, blurry photographs, and conspiracy theories. But none of them described anything like what I'd witnessed. The Sasquatch enthusiasts talked about intelligent, elusive creatures that avoided human contact. They described animals that were very much alive, possibly even possessing a primitive culture and communication system. What I'd seen bore no resemblance to those accounts. The thing in the woods had been unmistakably dead, moving through some process that violated every principle of biology I understood. I expanded my search to include zombies, though I felt ridiculous typing the words into the search bar. Most of the results were entertainment-related: movies, television shows, video games. The few scientific articles I found discussed Haitian folklore and the use of neurotoxins to create zombie-like states in humans. But again, nothing that explained how a massive, ape-like creature could continue functioning with catastrophic injuries and obvious decomposition. Around midnight, I stumbled across something that made me sit up straighter. It was a brief mention in a research paper about chronic wasting disease, CWD, a neurological disorder that affects deer, elk, and other cervids. The disease causes animals to lose weight, display abnormal behavior, and eventually die. But what caught my attention was a single paragraph about unusual locomotion in affected animals. According to the researchers, deer with advanced CWD sometimes continued moving, even after brain function had severely deteriorated. They described animals that seemed to be operating on basic motor impulses alone, walking in circles or straight lines for hours without apparent purpose. The disease affected the brain in ways that disrupted normal behavior, while leaving basic movement patterns intact. Could something similar affect other species? Could there be a variant of CWD that affected primates or whatever species the creature I'd seen represented? I spent the next hour researching prion diseases, the category of neurological disorders that included CWD. Mad cow disease was another example, along with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. The more I read, the more plausible it seemed. Prion diseases worked by corrupting proteins in the brain, causing them to misfold and clump together. The process was irreversible and always fatal, but it could take months or even years to fully destroy neural function. In the meantime, affected animals displayed increasingly bizarre behavior as different parts of their brains shut down. But even this explanation had major holes. The creature I'd seen wasn't just neurologically impaired, it was physically decomposed. The missing flesh, the exposed organs, the empty eye socket, these were signs of death and decay, not disease. No amount of prion corruption could explain how something in that condition could continue walking around. I closed the laptop and tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that horrible face again, the empty socket where an eye should have been. The mouth hanging open in a permanent expression of mindless hunger, the shambling gait that spoke of something operating beyond the normal constraints of life and death. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't face the prospect of going back into those woods, of patrolling the same area where I knew that thing was wandering. My supervisor was understanding, ranger work was stressful, and mental health days were not uncommon in our profession. Instead, I drove to the University of Montana in Missoula, about 2 hours south of Helena. I'd heard they had an excellent wildlife biology department, and I hoped someone there might be able to offer insights into what I'd witnessed. I couldn't tell them the truth, of course, but I could ask hypothetical questions about prion diseases and their effects on large mammals. Dr. Sandra Whitmore was a professor of wildlife pathology who'd spent 20 years studying disease in wild animal populations. She was in her early 50s with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that made her popular with both students and visiting law enforcement officers seeking expertise. Game wardens don't usually show up asking about CWD unless they found something troubling, she said after I'd introduced myself and explained my interest in neurological diseases. Hypothetically, I said carefully, what would be the most extreme symptoms you might see in an animal with advanced prion disease? Dr. Whitmore leaned back in her chair considering the question. Well, the brain deterioration can be quite extensive. We've documented deer that walk in perfect circles for hours, elk that approach humans without fear, moose that forget how to eat. The disease essentially erases learned behaviors and eventually disrupts even basic motor functions. Could an animal continue moving even if it was severely injured? That's an interesting question. Pain reception would certainly be affected as the disease progresses. We've seen deer with broken legs that continue trying to walk normally, as if they can't process the injury signals their bodies are sending. I thought about the creature's missing foot, the way it had walked on its ankle bone without apparent distress. What about primates? Could they be affected by similar diseases? Dr. Whitmore's expression became more guarded. There are prion diseases that affect primates, certainly. Kuru was documented in human populations in Papua New Guinea, but I'm not aware of any cases involving North American ape species. Because there aren't any North American ape species, I said. Exactly. She studied my face carefully. Is there something specific you're dealing with, Ranger? I wanted desperately to tell her everything, to describe what I'd seen and get her professional opinion. But I could already imagine how that conversation would go. At best, she'd think I was suffering from stress-related hallucinations. At worst, she'd question my fitness for duty and recommend psychiatric evaluation. Just trying to understand the possibilities, I said. Thank you for your time. As I drove back toward Helena, Dr. Whitmore's words echoed in my mind. There weren't any North American ape species. which meant that either I'd witnessed something that science hadn't yet cataloged, or I'd seen something that had once been cataloged but was supposed to be extinct. The third possibility, that I'd simply imagined the entire encounter, was becoming harder to accept. The memory was too vivid, too detailed, too consistent with itself to be a hallucination, and Bobby had seen the change in my demeanor, had recognized that I'd encountered something that shook me to my core. No, what I'd seen was real. The question was what to do about it. 3 days later, I forced myself to go back. I couldn't continue avoiding the area indefinitely without arousing suspicion from my supervisor. More importantly, I needed to know if the creature was still out there, still wandering through forests where hikers and hunters might encounter it. Whatever that thing was, it represented a potential danger to the public, and I had a professional duty to assess that threat. I returned to the same location where Bobby and I had investigated the poaching incident, but this time I came alone. I parked my patrol truck in the same spot on the shoulder and sat for several minutes gathering my courage. The October weather had turned colder, with low-hanging clouds that threatened snow. The forest looked different in the gray light, more ominous and less welcoming. I'd brought additional equipment this time, a digital camera with a telephoto lens, a portable GPS unit, and extra batteries for my radio. If I encountered the creature again, I wanted to document it properly. The photos would either provide evidence of something extraordinary or reveal that my memory had been corrupted by fear and stress. The walk up the ridge felt longer this time, each step weighted with dread. The blood trail I'd followed 3 days earlier had been washed away by a brief rainstorm, leaving no trace of the original poaching incident. But I wasn't looking for deer blood anymore. I was looking for signs of something far more disturbing. I reached the crest of the ridge and paused, listening carefully. The forest was quieter than it had been during my previous visit. Even the birds seemed subdued, their calls muted and infrequent. The silence felt oppressive, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Moving carefully down into the gully where I'd first seen the creature, I began searching for physical evidence. If something that large and that badly decomposed had passed through this area, it should have left traces. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, perhaps even tissue samples caught on branches or thorns. I found them near a fallen log about 50 yards from where the creature had first appeared. The tracks were unlike anything I'd seen in 20 years of wildlife work. They were enormous, easily twice the size of the largest human footprint but irregularly shaped. The right track showed clear evidence of the missing foot I'd observed, just a blunt impression where toes should have been. But it was the depth of the impressions that truly unsettled me. Despite the creature's obvious state of decay, it was still incredibly heavy. The track sank deep into the soft earth, deeper than even a healthy animal of that size should have made. It was as if the thing was made of stone rather than flesh and bone. I photographed each clear track from multiple angles, using a dollar bill for scale reference. The GPS coordinates went into my notebook along with detailed descriptions of what I'd found. This was evidence that could be analyzed, measured, compared to known animal tracks. It was proof that I hadn't imagined the encounter. Following the trail of tracks led me deeper into the gully, through areas where the canopy was so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. The creature had moved in a fairly straight line, pushing through thick brush without deviation. Whatever intelligence had once guided this thing, it no longer bothered with efficient pathfinding. After about a quarter mile, the tracks led to something that made my blood freeze. There, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, I found what could only be described as a nest. It wasn't built in the way that living animals construct shelters. There was no apparent design or engineering involved. Instead, it looked like someone had simply gathered every piece of organic debris in the area and piled it into a rough circle. Dead branches, fallen logs, clumps of moss, even what appeared to be animal bones, all heaped together in a depression between the roots of a massive tree. The smell hit me as I approached. It was the same overwhelming stench of decay I'd encountered during my first sighting, but concentrated and intensified. This was clearly where the creature had been spending time, perhaps sleeping or simply waiting for whatever drove it to move. I forced myself to examine the nest more closely, breathing through my mouth to minimize the assault on my senses. Mixed in with the organic debris were items that didn't belong, Pieces of fabric, a few scattered coins, what looked like a hiking boot. These were clearly things the creature had encountered and collected, though whether by accident or design was impossible to determine. Most disturbing were the bones. There were far too many of them, and they came from a variety of different animals. Deer bones mixed with what might have been elk, along with smaller fragments that could have come from rabbits or birds. Some of the bones showed clear tooth marks, suggesting they'd been gnawed on, but the marks were wrong. Too large and too widely spaced to have come from any known predator in the area. Was photographing a particularly large femur when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere behind me, back toward the direction I'd approached from. The same casual crashing through underbrush that I'd heard during my first encounter, accompanied by that awful smell getting stronger. The creature was returning to its nest and I was directly in its path. My training kicked in immediately. I had two choices: try to hide and hope it passed by, or retreat quickly before it arrived. Given the size of the clearing and the lack of adequate cover, hiding wasn't really an option. I gathered my equipment as quietly as possible and began moving toward the far side of the clearing, away from the approaching sounds. But I wasn't fast enough. As I reached the edge of the trees, the creature emerged into the clearing behind me. This time I got a much clearer look at it. In the gray afternoon light, every horrifying detail was visible with crystal clarity. The missing eye socket was even more pronounced than I'd remembered. A dark hollow that seemed to peer into nothing. The clouded remaining eye showed no recognition or intelligence, just the blank stare of something operating on pure instinct. The creature's movements were more labored than they'd been 3 days earlier. The missing foot made each step a struggle, and I could see that new injuries had appeared on its torso. Several ribs were now visible through torn flesh, and something that might have been part of a lung protruded from a gap between bones. But despite its deteriorating condition, the thing was still mobile, still driven by whatever force animated it. It shambled directly toward the nest, apparently unaware of my presence just 20 yards away. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as it began examining the contents of its grotesque shelter. What I witnessed next will haunt me for the rest of my life. The creature picked up one of the bones from the pile, a deer femur that still had scraps of flesh attached, and began gnawing on it with mechanical persistence. There was no hunger in the action, no satisfaction or enjoyment. It was simply a motion the thing performed, like a machine following its programming. The sound of teeth scraping against bone echoed through the clearing. Dark fluid, whether blood or some other bodily fluid, dripped from the creature's mouth as it chewed on tissues that were already in advanced stages of decomposition. The sight was so revolting that I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to prevent myself from retching. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the creature dropped the bone and settled into the nest. It didn't lie down in the way a living animal would rest. Instead, it simply stopped moving, remaining upright but motionless like a horrible statue placed in a shrine of decay. I waited another 10 minutes before beginning my retreat. Moving with extreme caution, I worked my way out of the gully and back up the ridge, constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. Only when I reached my patrol truck did I allow myself to breathe normally again. Sitting in my truck with the engine running and the heater blasting, I stared at the photos I'd taken on my camera's small display screen. The images were clear and detailed, showing tracks and evidence that no rational person could dismiss as imagination or hallucination. I had proof now, documented, measurable proof that something impossible was living in the Montana wilderness. But proof of what exactly? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information? The professional thing to do would be to report my findings immediately. Contact my supervisor. Call in a team of wildlife biologists, alert the proper authorities. But I could already imagine how that conversation would unfold. Game wardens who reported zombie Bigfoot sightings didn't tend to keep their jobs very long, regardless of how much photographic evidence they brought to the table. There was also the question of public safety. If this thing posed a genuine threat to hikers or hunters, I had a duty to warn people. But how do you issue a warning about something that shouldn't exist? How do you tell people to avoid an area because it's inhabited by a decomposing cryptid, without causing mass panic or becoming the subject of ridicule? I thought about Dr. Whitmore at the university. She might be willing to examine my photos and evidence, to offer a scientific perspective on what I'd documented. but even she would struggle to explain how something in that state of decay could continue functioning. The radio crackled to life, interrupting my thoughts. Dispatch was calling all units about a missing hiker in the Glacier National Park area, about 60 miles north of my current location. An experienced outdoorsman had failed to return from a solo camping trip, and search and rescue teams were being organized. For a moment, I felt a chill of possibility. Could there be a connection? Could the creature I'd been tracking have expanded its range, moved into areas where it might encounter unsuspecting humans? The timing could be coincidental, but the location was troubling close to known Bigfoot sighting areas. I keyed the radio to volunteer for the search operation, but then hesitated. If I was right about the connection, I'd be sending search teams into potential danger without warning them about what they might encounter. But if I was wrong, I'd be wasting resources and time that could mean the difference between life and death for the missing hiker. In the end, I made the decision that would change everything. I couldn't risk other people encountering what I'd seen without warning them first, but I also couldn't file an official report about zombie Bigfoot. The solution was to find someone I trusted, someone with enough experience and credibility to handle the information appropriately. I called Bobby Kowalski. "Hey, Vince," he answered on the second ring. "Heard you called in sick the other day. Everything okay?" "Bobby, I need to talk to you about what happened at that poaching scene. Can you meet me somewhere private?" There was a pause. "This about that scare you had in the woods?" "It's about a lot more than that." "Can you meet me at Murphy's Bar in an hour?" "Sure, kid. I'll be there." Murphy's Bar was a local establishment popular with law enforcement and emergency services personnel. It was the kind of place where off-duty cops and rangers could drink beer and trade stories without worrying about civilian oversight. More importantly, it had a back room that afforded privacy for sensitive conversations. Bobby was already there when I arrived, nursing a beer and looking concerned. He was still in uniform, having come directly from his shift. I bought a beer for myself and gestured toward the back room. "This is that kind of conversation?" he asked. "Yeah, it really is." We settled into a corner booth where we couldn't be overheard. I pulled out my camera and set it on the table between us. "Bobby, I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you with an open mind. And I need you to look at these photos before you decide I've lost my sanity." For the next 30 minutes, I told him everything. The blood trail that led to something impossible. The creature I'd witnessed shambling through the forest, the nest I'd discovered, and the evidence I'd collected. Bobby listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he reached for the camera and began scrolling through the photos. His face remained carefully neutral as he examined the tracks, the nest, the bones scattered around the clearing. "These tracks," he said finally. "You're sure they're real?" "I watched it make them, Bobby. I saw that thing walking on the stump of its ankle bone. And the smell you described? Worse than anything I've ever encountered. Worse than that week-old car accident victim we found 2 summers ago." Bobby continued studying the photos, zooming in on details and examining them from different angles. His 23 years of experience had taught him to read, sign, and evaluate evidence with scientific precision. I knew he was looking for signs of manipulation or hoax, anything that might explain what he was seeing in rational terms. "The bone damage," he said, pointing to one of the photos. "Those tooth marks are too big for any predator in this region." "That's what I thought too." "And you said this thing was definitely dead? Not just diseased or injured?" "Bobby, I've seen plenty of injured animals. This wasn't injury. Half its abdomen was missing. It was walking around with its intestines hanging out of its body." He set the camera down and looked at me directly. "Vince, in 23 years of doing this job, I've seen things that don't make it into official reports. Things that don't fit into neat categories or scientific explanations. But this, I know how it sounds. Do you? Because what you're describing challenges everything we understand about life and death. You're talking about something that should be impossible. But you believe me." Bobby was quiet for another long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I believe you saw something. And these photos, they're evidence of something that shouldn't exist. The question is what we do about it." Bobby and I spent the next 2 hours developing a plan. We couldn't file an official report, not yet anyway. but we also couldn't ignore the potential threat to public safety. Our solution was to create an unofficial watch on the area, monitoring it for signs of the creature while documenting everything we found. Bobby had contacts at the state university, people who might be willing to examine our evidence confidentially. He also knew search and rescue coordinators who could be quietly warned to exercise extra caution in certain areas, without being told exactly why. We agreed to return to the site together the following week, this time with better equipment and backup protocols. If the creature was still there, we'd attempt to gather more comprehensive evidence. If it had moved on, we'd try to track its path and predict where it might go next. But fate had other plans. 2 days later, Bobby called me at 6 a.m. His voice was grim and urgent. "Vince, we've got a problem. They found the missing hiker. Dead? Worse, turn on the news." I fumbled for the television remote, my heart already racing. The local morning news was leading with the story. A search and rescue team had found the missing hiker's remains in a remote area of Glacier National Park. The reporter's description of the scene made my blood run cold. The body had been discovered in a condition that defied explanation. According to the medical examiner's preliminary report, the victim showed signs of predation by an unknown animal. But the damage was unlike anything documented in North American wildlife attacks. The bite marks were too large, the pattern of injury too extensive for any known predator. More disturbing was the state of the campsite. The hiker's gear had been scattered across a wide area, as if something had investigated each item individually before discarding it. Personal belongings were mixed with organic debris in a pattern that reminded investigators of nest-building behavior. But it was the final detail that confirmed my worst fears. The reporter mentioned that search teams had found unusual tracks at the scene, enormous footprints that didn't match any cataloged North American wildlife. The track showed evidence of some kind of injury or deformity to the right foot. I called Bobby back immediately. "It moved north. Looks that way. The timing fits with when you last saw it." "Bobby, we have to do something. This thing killed someone." "I know. I'm already making calls." "Give me 2 hours, then meet me at the ranger station." When I arrived at the ranger station, Bobby had assembled a small group of people I'd never seen before. They included Dr. Sandra Whitmore from the university, whom I'd interviewed about prion diseases, and 2 other individuals who introduced themselves only by first names, presumably federal agents of some kind. "Ranger Russo," Dr. Whitmore said as I entered the conference room. "Ranger Kowalski has shared some very interesting photographs with us." The atmosphere in the room was tense but professional. These people were clearly taking the situation seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. If federal agents were involved, it meant that what I'd discovered had implications beyond simple wildlife management. One of the agents, a woman who looked to be in her 40s with prematurely gray hair, spoke first. "We need you to understand that everything discussed in this room is classified. You'll be signing documentation to that effect before you leave." "What kind of documentation?" I asked. "The kind that ensures this conversation never happened," the other agent replied. He was younger, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested military background, at least as far as public record is concerned. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward. "Ranger Russo, what you've documented appears to be related to a biological phenomenon we've been tracking for several years. This isn't the first incident of its kind. There are others, isolated cases, scattered across multiple states, always in remote wilderness areas, always involving what witnesses describe as impossible creatures that appear to be both dead and mobile." The female agent pulled out a file folder and removed several photographs. They showed tracks similar to what I'd documented, along with images of disturbed campsites and scattered remains. We've been calling them Class D entities. The designation stands for deceased locomotive. "You mean there are multiple zombie Bigfoot creatures wandering around?" "We don't use that terminology," the male agent said sharply. "But yes, there appear to be several entities exhibiting similar characteristics. The one you encountered appears to be the most advanced case we've documented." Dr. Whitmore spread out additional papers on the table. "We believe these entities are the result of an unknown pathogen, something that can reanimate deceased tissue while maintaining basic motor functions. It's unlike any disease process we've previously encountered." "Are they dangerous?" "The Glacier Park incident suggests they can be. the female agent replied. Previous encounters have been limited to livestock predation and property damage. This is the first confirmed human fatality. Bobby had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now he spoke up. What do you need from us? Continued monitoring and documentation, Dr. Whitmore said. If the entity returns to the area where Ranger Russo first encountered it, we need to know immediately. We're assembling a response team, but we need real-time intelligence. The male agent handed me a secure satellite phone. This connects directly to our operations center. If you see the entity again, call immediately. Don't attempt to approach or interact with it under any circumstances. What happens when you catch it? That's classified, the female agent said. But we can tell you that public safety is our primary concern. These entities represent a potential threat that must be contained. As we prepared to leave the meeting, Dr. Whitmore pulled me aside. Ranger Russo, I want you to understand the significance of what you've documented. This could represent a completely new form of post-mortem biological activity. The scientific implications are staggering. And the public safety implications are equally significant. If this pathogen can affect one unknown hominid species, there's no telling what else it might be capable of. We need to understand it before it spreads. Driving home that evening, I found myself looking at the Montana wilderness with completely different eyes. The forests I'd spent my career protecting now seemed to harbor secrets that challenged the very foundations of biological science. Somewhere out there, something that should have been dead was continuing to move, to hunt, to exist in defiance of natural law. The secure phone sat on my passenger seat, a tangible reminder that my life had changed forever. I was no longer just a game warden. I was part of a classified operation dealing with threats that existed beyond public knowledge or understanding. 3 weeks later, I was shot by a drunk poacher during an unrelated incident. The bullet shattered my left shoulder and ended my career as a field ranger. During my recovery, I received word through unofficial channels that the entity I'd encountered had been contained by the federal response team. I never learned exactly what that meant. Now, 5 years later, I work as a civilian consultant for the state wildlife department, mostly desk work and training new rangers. I've never spoken publicly about what I witnessed in those woods, and I never will. The classification agreements I signed ensure that. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder how many other impossible things are wandering through the American wilderness. How many other creatures that shouldn't exist are living in the spaces between what science understands and what nature allows. I hope I never find out, but I also hope that if someone else encounters what I did, they'll have the courage to document it, to report it, to ensure that the proper authorities are alerted. Because if there's one thing I learned from my experience, it's that the world contains horrors we're not prepared to acknowledge. And ignoring them doesn't make them go away. I never imagined that my 33rd year would bring me face to face with something that would shake my understanding of what lurks in the quiet places of this world. My name doesn't matter now. What matters is what happened during those 48 hours in October, when the Swedish wilderness showed me its true face. Living in Småland, in a town so small it barely registers on most maps, you learn to appreciate the vast stretches of untouched forest that surround you. The silence here isn't just quiet, it's absolute. Broken only by the wind through ancient pines and the distant call of loons across hidden lakes. I've always found solace in these wild places, especially after my divorce 2 years ago left me searching for something I couldn't name. The back problems that had plagued me through the summer were finally manageable by mid-October. Months of physiotherapy and careful stretching had given me enough mobility to consider my annual camping trip to Djupsjön, the deep lake, a remote body of water nestled in a chain of connected waterways about 3 hours, hike from the nearest road. The locals in my town speak of it in hushed tones, not because of any superstition, but because of its raw, untamed beauty and the way sound carries across its surface in the dead of night. My friend Astrid agreed to join me, though I could tell she had reservations. She's always been more comfortable with her creature comforts than I am. But she understood my need to reclaim this ritual that had become so important to my mental health. We packed carefully. October camping in Sweden demands respect for the elements. Our gear included heavy sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, waterproof everything, and enough food for 4 days in case weather trapped us longer than planned. The hike in took us along increasingly narrow trails, marked only by faded blazes on tree trunks and occasional cairns left by previous hikers. The forest grew denser as we climbed, the canopy blocking out more and more daylight until we were walking through a green-tinted twilight even at midday. The sound of our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, our breathing visible in small puffs despite the mild temperature. When we finally emerged at the lake's edge around 4 in the afternoon, I was struck by how different it looked from my memories. The water level seemed lower than usual, exposing more of the rocky shoreline and revealing the skeletal remains of drowned trees that normally stayed hidden beneath the surface. These pale, twisted branches reached up from the depths like gnarled fingers, creating an almost cemetery-like atmosphere around the lake's perimeter. Several other groups had already established camp, more than I'd ever seen here before. A young couple with kayaks had claimed the best spot on the eastern shore, while a family with 2 children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, had set up an elaborate campsite complete with a screened dining fly. Their laughter echoed across the water as they played on the narrow beach, the sound both comforting and somehow unsettling in its intensity. We found a decent spot about 50 meters from the water's edge, close enough to enjoy the view, but far enough back to avoid the moisture that would rise from the lake as temperatures dropped overnight. As we set up our tent, I noticed how the other campers kept glancing toward the water nervously, their conversations dropping to whispers whenever the wind died down completely. The process of making camp took on an almost ritualistic quality as the afternoon wore on. Every stake driven into the ground, every guy line adjusted, felt like we were marking our territory in a place that didn't quite welcome human presence. The old wind shelter Astrid and I decided to use for our evening fire sat about 30 meters from our tent, its corrugated metal roof partially collapsed on one side and graffitied with initials and dates going back decades. Someone had carved "God Protect Us All, 1987, into one of the support beams, the letters deep and precise as if made with desperate intention rather than casual vandalism. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the rough edges of the cuts, and wondered what had prompted such an urgent plea in this seemingly peaceful place. The fireplace itself was in better condition than the shelter, built from local stones and blackened by countless previous fires. Someone had left a decent supply of split birch and pine, though the wood felt unusually damp for October. It took several attempts and half a tube of fire-starting paste to get flames going, and even then, the fire seemed reluctant to catch properly, producing more smoke than heat in those first crucial minutes. As evening approached, the temperature began dropping more rapidly than I'd expected. My weather app showed clear skies and mild temperatures, but the air felt thick and oppressive like it does before a severe thunderstorm. The other campers seemed to sense it too. Conversations became more subdued, and I noticed the family with children kept glancing up at the sky as if expecting clouds that weren't there. Dinner was a simple affair of instant pasta and canned sauce, but even the familiar ritual of cooking over an open flame felt different somehow. The flames danced in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, casting shadows that moved independently of their source. Astrid commented on it first, pausing mid-sentence to stare at the fire with a puzzled expression. "Have you ever seen flames move like that?" she asked, pointing to where the fire seemed to be reaching toward the lake, bending at impossible angles despite the complete absence of wind. I had noticed it too, but hearing her voice, my unease made it suddenly more real, more threatening. The fire was behaving like it was being drawn toward something, pulled by an invisible force that had nothing to do with air currents or fuel distribution. When I tried to photograph the phenomenon, my phone camera refused to focus properly, producing only blurred images that showed nothing unusual. The children from the family campsite had grown quieter as darkness fell, staying close to their parents instead of exploring the shoreline as they had earlier. I caught their father scanning the tree line repeatedly, his hand resting on what looked like a large hunting knife on his belt. When our eyes met across the distance between our camps, he offered a tense smile and a nod, but didn't approach for the usual camping small talk about weather and trail conditions. By 9 o'clock, full darkness had settled over the lake like a heavy blanket. The water, which had been mirror-smooth during the day, now moved with small, regular swells that seemed to originate from no particular source. These waves lapped against the shore with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, but just irregular enough to keep you from getting comfortable with the sound. Astrid and I had retreated to the warmth of our sleeping bags by 10:30, though neither of us felt particularly tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from fresh air and physical activity seemed absent, replaced by a restless energy that made relaxation impossible. We lay in our respective sleeping bags, making quiet conversation about everything except the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. The sounds of the lake at night were unlike anything I remembered from previous visits. Instead of the gentle lapping of small waves, the water moved with purpose, creating sounds that resembled footsteps, deliberate, measured, circling. When I mentioned this to Astrid, she admitted she'd been listening to the same thing for the past hour, trying to convince herself it was just the wind or settling ice, though the temperature hadn't dropped below freezing. Around midnight, Astrid's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, but rest continued to evade me. My back ached despite the comfortable sleeping pad, and every small sound from outside seemed amplified to an unbearable degree. The zipper on our tent fly rattled with each breath of wind, creating a metallic chattering that sounded almost like Morse code. That's when I first became aware of the watching. It started as a feeling, the familiar sensation of being observed that makes the hair on your neck stand up. But this was more intense than anything I'd experienced before. A presence so focused and deliberate that it felt almost physical, like a weight pressing down on the tent from above. I found myself holding my breath, listening for any sound that might explain the sensation, but the night had gone completely quiet. Even the water had stopped its rhythmic movement against the shore. I reached for my phone to check the time, squinting at the bright screen in the darkness. 2:47 a.m. The battery showed full charge, but the signal bars were completely absent. Not unusual this far into the wilderness, but my phone had shown at least one bar when we'd arrived. Now it displayed no service with the finality of a door slamming shut. The first sound came from directly above us. It started as a soft scratching against the tent's rainfly, like branches brushing against the fabric in the wind. But the scratching was too regular, too purposeful to be random contact with vegetation. It moved in deliberate patterns across the roof of our tent, pausing at the corners as if testing the structural integrity of our shelter. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as the scratching continued its circuit around our tent. 3 times it made the complete loop, roof down the side, across the bottom edge, up the other side, back to the roof. Each circuit took exactly the same amount of time, as if whatever was making the sound was following a predetermined route with mechanical precision. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound had been. At least while I could hear the scratching, I knew where the threat was located. Now, whatever had been testing our defenses could be anywhere, circling back for another approach, moving to a different position, or simply waiting for us to let our guard down. I reached over carefully to wake Astrid, but she was already awake, her eyes wide and reflecting what little light filtered through the tent walls. She held up a finger to her lips, then pointed toward the tent's entrance. Through the thin fabric, we could see the shadow of something large moving past, blocking out what little starlight made it through the forest canopy. The shadow paused directly in front of our tent. What stood outside our tent defied easy description. Through the translucent fabric, we could see its outline, roughly human in proportions but wrong in every detail that mattered. Too tall, too broad at the shoulders, with limbs that seemed to bend at joints that shouldn't exist. It remained motionless for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, as if studying our reactions to its presence. I found myself analyzing every detail I could make out, trying to find rational explanations that refused to come. The shape was definitely bipedal, but its posture was all wrong, leaning forward in a way that suggested a different center of gravity than any human would have. When it moved, it did so with a fluid motion that reminded me of water flowing uphill, natural in its own way but fundamentally disturbing to observe. Astrid had pressed herself against the far side of the tent, as far from the entrance as possible, her sleeping bag pulled up to her chin. I could hear her trying to control her breathing, taking slow, deliberate breaths through her nose to avoid making any sound that might draw the thing's attention. Her face was pale in the dim light, eyes fixed on the shadow that continued its patient vigil just outside our door. The temperature inside the tent began dropping noticeably. Despite our body heat and the insulation of our sleeping bags, our breath became visible, small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the increasingly frigid air. This wasn't the gradual cooling you'd expect from a clear night. It was as if something was actively drawing heat from our immediate environment. Reached for the small knife I kept clipped to the inside of the tent, more for comfort than any realistic hope it would be useful against whatever was out there. The metal was so cold it almost burned my fingers, and I realized that the temperature drop was severe enough to affect our gear. Our water bottles, which had been room temperature when we went to bed, now showed a skin of ice around their contents. The shadow began moving again, but this time its motion was different, more exploratory, almost curious. It reached toward the tent with what might have been an arm, pressing against the fabric from outside. The tent wall bent inward under the pressure, forming an impression that looked almost like a handprint, but with too many fingers, each one too long and jointed in the wrong places. The pressure increased gradually, stretching the fabric to its limits. I could hear the synthetic material beginning to stress, making tiny popping sounds as individual threads reached their breaking point. If this continued, our tent, our only barrier between us and whatever was out there, would tear open, leaving us exposed and defenseless. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure stopped. The shadow withdrew, and we heard footsteps moving away from our campsite, but not the footsteps of any creature I could identify. They were too heavy, landing with a solid impact of something much larger than a human, but spaced too far apart for any animal I knew. Each step seemed to sink deep into the ground, as if the thing walking was far heavier than its size would suggest. We tracked its movement by sound as it circled our camp in a wide arc, staying just at the edge of visibility in the forest. The footsteps had a wet quality to them, like boots squelching through mud, though the ground around our campsite had been relatively dry. Occasionally, we heard the sound of branches breaking under its weight, though the forest here wasn't particularly dense. The circuit it made around our position took nearly 10 minutes, a leisurely pace that suggested it wasn't in any hurry to leave. When it completed the circle, returning to approximately where it had started, the footsteps stopped entirely. Once again, we were left in complete silence, not knowing where the threat had gone or whether it was still nearby. What happened next challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The silence that had fallen over our campsite was broken by a sound from the lake. Not the gentle lapping of waves, but something that resembled human speech, though distorted beyond easy recognition. Voices seemed to rise from the water itself, multiple conversations overlapping in languages that might have been Swedish, or might have been something else entirely. The words were just clear enough to be maddening. I found myself straining to understand, catching fragments that sounded like names, like pleas, like warnings given too late to matter. Astrid grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in so hard I knew there would be bruises the next day. She was hearing it too, this impossible conversation between the living water and something that answered from beneath its surface. "Do you understand what they're saying?" she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the complete silence of our tent. I shook my head, though I wasn't entirely truthful. Some of the words were becoming clearer as my ears adjusted to the strange acoustics. I heard "go into Nurmara, don't come closer," repeated several times in what sounded like a child's voice. Other phrases were less distinct but carried an unmistakable tone of urgency, of warning. The voices seemed to be coming from different depths in the lake, some sounding like they were just below the surface while others echoed up from much deeper water. This created a layered effect like a choir singing in rounds, but the harmonies were all wrong, creating dissonances that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. As we listened, the conversations began to organize themselves into something approaching coherence. It became clear that some voices were asking questions while others provided answers, though the answers were rarely reassuring. The deeper voices, the ones that seemed to come from the very bottom of the lake, spoke with an authority that the surface voices lacked, giving instructions or pronouncements that were received with what sounded like fear or resignation. I realized that I was beginning to understand more of what was being said, as if exposure to the sounds was teaching me their meaning through some process that bypassed normal language acquisition. This understanding brought with it a growing sense of horror as the content of the conversations became clear. They were discussing us, The surface voices, the ones that sounded most human, were reporting on our presence, describing our campsite, our gear, our apparent level of preparation or vulnerability. The deeper voices asked questions about our behavior, our defenses, our likely responses to different approaches. It was like listening to predators plan an attack, comparing notes on the best strategies for dealing with their prey. But there was something else in the conversation that was even more disturbing. References to previous visitors, other campers who had come to this lake over the years. The voices spoke of them with the casual familiarity of creatures discussing a regular food source, comparing the relative merits of different groups, different individuals, different methods of approach. One surface voice, speaking in what I now clearly recognized as Swedish, mentioned the family with children currently camped on the eastern shore. The description was detailed and clinical, noting the parents' vigilance, the children's movements during the day, the layout of their campsite. The deep voice that responded gave what sounded like approval, followed by instructions that I couldn't quite make out but that filled me with a cold dread. The voices were planning something for tonight, and it involved all of us. At 3:47 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the voices from the lake had fallen silent, we heard the first scream. It came from the direction of the family's campsite, high-pitched and filled with terror, the scream of a child who has seen something that their young mind cannot process or accept. The sound cut through the night air like a blade, sharp and clean and absolutely horrible in its intensity. It was followed immediately by a second scream, different in pitch but equally terrified as the other child joined the first. Astrid and I were out of our sleeping bags and moving toward the tent entrance before we'd consciously decided to act. Every instinct told us to stay hidden, to avoid drawing attention to ourselves, but the sound of children in mortal terror overrode our self-preservation. I grabbed the large flashlight from my pack while Astrid found her hiking boots, and we prepared to leave the relative safety of our tent. The screaming continued, but it was moving, not staying in one place as you'd expect if the children were in their tent or campsite, but traveling in a path that seemed to lead toward the water. Mixed with the children's voices, we could hear their parents shouting, calling their names, their voices raw with panic and desperation. I unzipped the tent fly and stepped into the night, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness so complete it seemed solid. The beam only extended about 20 meters before being swallowed by the black air, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with us as we hurried toward the eastern shore. The ground between our campsite and the family's location was rougher than I remembered from the daylight crossing, filled with roots and holes that seemed designed to trip us up. More than once I had to grab Astrid's arm to keep her from falling, and twice she did the same for me as we navigated terrain that seemed to shift and change under our feet. As we got closer to the other campsite, the screaming began to fade, not because it was ending but because it was moving away from us toward the lake. The parents' voices were closer now and I could make out individual words in their panicked calls. They were Swedish from Stockholm based on their accent, and they were calling for Maya and Eric, the children whose screams were now coming from somewhere near the water's edge. When we reached their campsite, we found chaos. Their tent had been torn open from the outside, the fabric shredded as if by massive claws. Camping gear was scattered in all directions, and their carefully organized camp kitchen had been completely destroyed. The parents, a woman in her 30s and a man about my age, were standing at the edge of the light from our flashlight, calling desperately into the darkness. "Our children," the woman said when she saw us, switching to accented English. "Something took our children. We heard them screaming, and when we got out of the tent, they were gone. The screaming is coming from the lake, but we can't see anything." The man was already moving toward the water, following the sound of voices that were growing fainter with each passing moment. "Maya, Eric, where are you?" he called, his voice cracking with emotion. I aimed my flashlight toward the lake, but the beam seemed weaker here, as if the darkness around the water was particularly resistant to illumination. We could still hear the children, but their voices were different now, less panicked, more confused, as if they were no longer certain of their own situation. That's when we saw the shapes in the water. The lake, which had been mirror smooth when we arrived, was now churning with movement. Dark shapes broke the surface at irregular intervals, too large and too numerous to be fish, too purposeful in their movements to be debris stirred up by wind. In the weak beam of my flashlight, I could make out what looked like heads, or at least rounded protrusions that turned toward our light as if aware of our presence. The children's voices were definitely coming from the water now, but they sounded wrong, too calm, too accepting of their situation. Instead of the panicked screaming we'd heard earlier, Maya and Eric were now speaking in conversational tones, as if they were discussing something mildly interesting, rather than finding themselves somehow transported to the middle of a dark lake in the middle of the night. "They're talking to something," Astrid whispered, her hand gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. "Listen, they're answering questions." She was right. The children's voices had taken on the rhythm of a dialogue, pausing as if listening to responses we couldn't hear, then answering in the polite, careful tones children use when talking to adult strangers. But there was something else in their voices now, a dreamy quality as if they were speaking from within a trance or under some form of influence. The parents had heard it too. The father was already wading into the lake, ignoring the shocking cold of the water as he pushed deeper, following the sound of his children's voices. "Maya, Eric, swim to me, can you hear me?" he called, but his children didn't seem to register his presence at all. The mother grabbed my flashlight, aiming it toward where her husband was now waist-deep in the dark water. In the beam, we could see more of the shapes surrounding him, sleek dark forms that moved with intelligence and purpose. They weren't approaching him directly, but they were definitely watching him, circling at a distance that seemed calculated to prevent escape while avoiding direct confrontation. "There are so many of them," the mother breathed, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and awe. "What are they? What do they want with our children?" I couldn't answer because I was beginning to understand something that I desperately didn't want to acknowledge. The shapes in the water weren't random creatures that had wandered into the lake. They belonged here. This was their territory, their hunting ground, and we were all intruders who had stumbled into something far older and more dangerous than any of us had imagined. The father had reached the point where the lake bottom dropped away sharply, and he was now swimming toward where the children's voices seemed strongest. But as he moved deeper into the lake, the voices began moving away from him, staying just out of reach. It was clear that whatever had the children was leading him deeper, drawing him away from shore and safety. That's when the other sounds started. From all around the lake's perimeter came new voices, not the children this time, but adults speaking in low, urgent tones. These voices were coming from the forest, from the shoreline, from positions that encircled our entire group. As I listened, I realized that some of these voices sounded familiar, speaking with accents and inflections that reminded me of people I knew from my hometown. But that was impossible. We were hours away from any settlement, days away from anyone who might know us personally. Yet the voices continued calling out names I recognized, using phrases and references that were specific to my life, my relationships, my personal history. One voice, coming from the forest behind our original campsite, was calling my name in a tone that sounded exactly like my ex-husband, the man I'd divorced 2 years ago and hadn't spoken to since. He was calling me to come to him, telling me he'd been looking for me, that he had something important to say. The voice was perfect, down to the slight lisp he had when he was emotional, but I knew it couldn't be him. It couldn't be any of them. Dawn came slowly to the lake, creeping across the water like oil spreading over glass. By the time the first pale light began filtering through the forest canopy, the voices had fallen silent, the shapes in the water had disappeared, and the lake had returned to its deceptive tranquility. But the damage had been done, and nothing would ever be the same for any of us who survived that night. The father had been found floating face down near the center of the lake, his body showing no signs of violence or struggle. He appeared to have simply stopped swimming, stopped fighting, and allowed himself to sink beneath the surface. When the authorities arrived later that morning, summoned by an emergency beacon one of the other campers had activated, they would list the cause of death as accidental drowning, possibly due to hypothermia and disorientation. Maya and Eric were never found. The official search lasted 5 days, involving divers, sonar equipment, and teams of volunteers who combed every inch of the lake and surrounding forest. They found no trace of the children, no bodies, no clothing, no evidence that they had ever been at the lake at all. The only proof of their existence was their mother's testimony and the family photos on her phone. images that seemed to grow fainter each time she looked at them. The other campers corroborated parts of our story: the torn tent, the parents' obvious distress, the father's desperate swim into the dark water. But none of them remembered hearing the children's screams. None of them had seen the shapes moving in the lake, and none of them could explain why their own sleep had been so deep and undisturbed while chaos erupted around them. Astrid and I gave our statements to the police, describing what we had witnessed as accurately as we could. But even as we spoke, I could see the skepticism in the officers' eyes, the way they exchanged glances when they thought we weren't looking. Our story sounded like the result of stress, sleep deprivation, and the kind of group hysteria that sometimes affects people in isolated situations. The mother left with the search and rescue team on the third day, her face hollow with grief and shock. She looked at Astrid and me before getting into the helicopter, her eyes holding questions she couldn't voice and accusations she couldn't prove. We had been there when her children vanished. We had witnessed their disappearance, and yet we had done nothing to save them. The lake was closed to camping indefinitely, though no official reason was given. A small sign was posted at the trailhead citing environmental concerns and ongoing research, but those of us who had been there knew the real reason. Something lived in those dark waters, something that had claimed the lake as its own territory and would not tolerate intruders. I returned home to my small town, to my quiet life, to the familiar routines that had once brought me comfort, but sleep became my enemy, filled with dreams of dark water and voices calling from impossible depths. During the day, I found myself avoiding any body of water larger than a bathtub, crossing bridges with my eyes fixed straight ahead, unable to look down at the rivers flowing beneath. Astrid moved to Stockholm a month later, citing job opportunities and the need for a change of scenery. We spoke once after she left, a brief, awkward conversation that ended with both of us acknowledging that our friendship had become another casualty of that night by the lake. Some experiences are too intense to survive, too terrible to be shared without destroying the people who shared them. The official investigation was closed after 6 months. The case filed under accidental death with missing persons presumed drowned. The lake was eventually reopened to hikers and campers, though it never regained its former popularity. Those who did venture there reported unusually poor fishing, electronic equipment that malfunctioned for no apparent reason, and a general feeling of unease that made extended stays unpleasant. I never returned to Djupsjön, though I drive past the trailhead several times a year on my way to other hiking destinations. Each time I slow down and look toward the forest path that leads to the lake, wondering if the families who occasionally walk that trail with their children in camping gear have any idea what they might encounter in those dark waters. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still and my small town seems wrapped in unnatural silence, I can still hear them, the voices from the lake, calling across impossible distances to remind me that some places in this world belong to things that are older, stranger, and far more dangerous than we like to believe. The children are still out there, somewhere beneath the surface of that black water, and they're no longer alone. God help anyone who goes looking for them. Having the grandchildren over was always a treasured time for us, as we were now in our mid-60s. The autumn of 2023 had been particularly beautiful, with the maple trees in our backyard painting themselves in brilliant reds and golds. I had built a fire pit several years ago, and it had become the heart of our family gatherings. The crackling flames seemed to draw stories from the depths of memory like moths to light. On this particular October evening, the air carried that crisp bite that promised winter's approach. I was finishing up some yard work when I noticed a cluster of my grandchildren gathered around the fire pit, their voices hushed in that particular way children adopt when discussing forbidden topics. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces, making their expression seem almost ghostly in the flickering light. As I approached, carrying an armload of split oak, I caught fragments of their conversation. Words like creature and forest and real drifted on the night air. The oldest of them, Grace, was shaking her head emphatically, her long brown hair catching the firelight. "No, nothing like that is real," she declared with the certainty only a 13-year-old can muster. "I don't believe it." I set the wood down beside the fire and brushed the bark from my hands. The children looked up at me with a mixture of guilt and curiosity. as if they'd been caught discussing something they shouldn't. One of them, my youngest grandson Tyler, looked directly at me with those wide blue eyes that reminded me so much of his grandmother. "Grandpa," he said, using the name they'd all adopted for me years ago, "are Wendigos real?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, and for a moment the warm fire seemed to offer no comfort against the sudden chill that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep inside my bones. The word itself seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy with implications I hadn't thought about in decades. "Now, where did you ever hear about that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and casual. But I could hear the slight tremor that crept in despite my efforts. Tyler shifted on his log seat, the wood creaking under his weight. "Kids at school were saying that their older brother saw them on YouTube and they're real. They said there are videos and everything." Grace rolled her eyes with the exaggerated drama of a teenager. "YouTube videos prove nothing, Tyler, right, Grandpa?" She looked at me expectantly, clearly waiting for adult validation of her skepticism. I found myself hesitating, staring into the fire as memories I'd kept buried for over 4 decades began to claw their way to the surface. The flames seemed to flicker in patterns that reminded me of another fire, in another time, in a place where the silence between the trees held secrets that could drive a person mad. "Well now," I said slowly, "there are lots of things we don't know about in this world, kids. Lots of things that might seem impossible until you experience them yourself." Just then, my son David walked up from the house, drawn by the sound of our conversation. He'd been helping his mother Helen clean up after dinner, but something in my tone must have carried across the yard. He knew me well enough to recognize when I was wrestling with something significant. "Maybe it's time you told your story, Dad," he said quietly, settling onto one of the stumps we'd arranged around the fire pit. "You've carried it long enough." The suggestion sent a jolt through me. I'd never told the complete story to anyone, not even Helen. Oh, she knew something had happened during that hunting trip back in 1981, when I was just 22 years old. I'd come home different, jumpier, with a haunted look that took months to fade. But the details, the things I'd seen and heard and smelled in those northern Arizona mountains, those I'd kept locked away in the darkest corners of my mind. David began gathering the other children who had been playing in the yard, and soon we had a proper circle formed around the fire. More wood was added, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. Helen appeared at my shoulder, her warm hands settling on my shoulders in that way she'd done for 43 years of marriage. Her touch was reassuring, grounding me in the present moment. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, all turned toward me with that particular intensity, children reserved for stories that might change how they see the world. The fire popped and hissed, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, lonely and mournful. "All right," I said, taking a deep breath that seemed to draw in decades of suppressed memory, along with the smoke-scented air. "But you need to understand something first. What I'm about to tell you, it changed me. Changed how I see the world, how I understand what's possible and what isn't. Some of you might not sleep well tonight after hearing this." Grace leaned forward, her skepticism wavering slightly. "It's just a story, right, Grandpa?" I met her eyes across the fire, and she must have seen something there that made her sit back against her mother's knees. "I wish it were, sweetheart. I truly wish it were." The story I was about to tell began in early December of 1981, when the world seemed both larger and smaller than it does today. There was no internet, no cell phones, no GPS devices to guide you if you got lost in the wilderness. When you went into the mountains in those days, you were truly on your own, dependent on your knowledge, your equipment, and your instincts. I was 22 then, fresh out of college and working my first real job at a lumber mill in Flagstaff. My father, your great-grandfather Vernon, had planned a hunting trip to the remote areas of northern Arizona near the Colorado border. It was to be a 3-generation expedition. Vernon, his brother Charles, and myself. The kind of tradition that bound families together and passed knowledge from old to young. The preparations began weeks in advance. Charles had a beautiful 16-foot travel trailer that he pulled behind his massive Ford pickup truck, a beast of a vehicle with oversized tires and a winch mounted on the front bumper. We spent hours checking and rechecking our gear: rifles, ammunition, clothing, food supplies, medical kit, communications equipment, though that last item was limited to handheld radios with maybe a 5-mile range on a good day. The morning we left, December 8, 1981, dawned clear and cold. Frost covered everything in crystalline patterns that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. I remember the way my breath steamed in the frigid air as we loaded the last of our supplies. The excitement of adventure mixing with the nervousness that always accompanied trips into truly remote country. The drive to our hunting area took most of the day. We followed increasingly primitive roads, from interstate highway to state routes to Forest Service roads to barely maintained tracks that challenged even Charles's four-wheel drive truck. With each mile, the sense of civilization fell away behind us like a discarded coat. The landscape gradually transformed from the high desert plains around Flagstaff to the dense pine and aspen forests of the higher elevations. Snow began to appear, first in patches on the north-facing slopes, then covering everything in a blanket of white that muffled sound and transformed familiar shapes into alien forms. We reached our destination around 3:30 in the afternoon, just as the short December day began to fade toward evening. Charles had scouted this location the previous season, a natural clearing beside a small creek, surrounded by thick stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The trees created a natural windbreak while still allowing us access to water and providing clear sight lines in several directions. Setting up camp was a well-rehearsed routine. Charles positioned the trailer to take advantage of the natural shelter, while I gathered firewood and Vernon set up our outdoor kitchen area. By the time full darkness fell, we had a roaring fire going and the smell of grilling elk steaks filled the cold air. That first evening was perfect in the way that only such moments can be. We sat around the fire, telling stories and sharing the kind of easy conversation that comes when men who respect each other are removed from the distractions of everyday life. Vernon told stories about his father's hunting expeditions in the 1930s. Charles shared tales from his years as a Forest Service ranger. I mostly listened, absorbing the wisdom and experience being shared, feeling the deep satisfaction of being accepted as an equal in this fraternity of outdoorsmen. The stars that night seemed impossibly bright and close, unpolluted by city lights or atmospheric haze. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and the silence between our conversations was the kind of profound quiet that exists only in true wilderness. Occasionally, we'd hear the distant call of an owl or the rustle of some small animal moving through the underbrush. But these sounds only emphasized the vast emptiness surrounding us. As the fire burned down to glowing coals, we made our plans for the next day's hunt. The area was known for its large elk herds, and Charles had spotted sign of a particularly impressive bull during his scouting trip. The strategy was simple but effective. Vernon would position himself at the mouth of a canyon that served as a natural funnel, while Charles and I would work the ridges on either side, hoping to spot game or drive it toward Vernon's position. I went to bed that night filled with anticipation, my Winchester .30-30 cleaned and loaded beside my sleeping bag, my hunting knife sharp and ready. In my pack, I carried not only the standard supplies but also my grandfather's old Colt .45 semi-automatic, a weapon he'd carried in the Pacific during World War II. I'd practiced with it extensively and felt confident in my ability to use it if necessary, though I couldn't have imagined then how desperately I would come to need that confidence. The trailer was warm and comfortable, insulated against the bitter cold outside. Through the small windows, I could see the last embers of our fire glowing like tiny stars fallen to earth. The silence was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the trailer and the clearing and the entire world beyond. I was awakened the next morning by Vernon's gentle but insistent nudge against my shoulder. "Time to get up, son," he said in that quiet voice he used when he didn't want to wake the whole camp. Day's burning. The interior of the trailer was cold enough that I could see my breath, but the smell of fresh coffee was already beginning to fill the small space. Vernon had always been an early riser, and the coffee was one of his rituals that marked the beginning of any serious day. I could never drink it black the way he and Charles did. It was like liquid tar strong enough to dissolve spoons. I always had to add some flavored creamer, which they tolerated with the patient amusement older men show for the weaknesses of youth. After a breakfast of eggs, bacon and toast cooked on the camp stove, we began the process of gearing up for the hunt. The temperature outside was well below freezing, and every piece of equipment we touched seemed to leach the heat from our fingers. My breath formed clouds that lingered in the still air, and the snow crunched under our boots with the particular squeak that comes only with truly cold conditions. I loaded my Winchester with 6 rounds of 180-grain ammunition, powerful enough to drop an elk cleanly at reasonable range. Another 8 rounds went into the sleeve attached to my rifle stock. The Colt 45 hung heavy on my hip, its weight both reassuring and somehow ominous. I'd carried it before on hunting trips, but something about this morning made its presence seem more significant. The plan was straightforward. Vernon would hike to the mouth of the canyon and position himself where he could cover the most likely exit route for any game we might encounter. Charles would take the eastern ridge, using his years of experience to read the signs and anticipate animal movement. I would work the western ridge, keeping pace with Charles but maintaining enough distance to avoid pushing the elk toward the wrong canyon. We separated at the edge of camp, each heading in a different direction. The snow was deep enough to muffle our footsteps but not so deep as to make walking difficult. Under the dense canopy of pine and fir, much of the forest floor remained relatively clear, the thick branches above creating a natural roof that kept most of the snow from reaching the ground. I had been walking for perhaps an hour when I first noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, mixing with the clean sense of snow and pine that dominated the mountain air. But as I continued along the ridge, it became more pronounced, a wet animal odor that reminded me of a dog that had been rolling in something unpleasant. My first thought was that it might be bear sign, which would have been unusual but not impossible for December in northern Arizona. The terrain along the ridge was challenging, with rocky outcroppings and thick stands of scrub oak that required careful navigation. I moved slowly, trying to balance the need for stealth with the practical necessity of covering ground. Every few minutes I would stop to listen and scan the area below, looking for movement or any sign of the elk we were hunting. It was during one of these pauses that I first heard the sound. It came from somewhere below and to my left, down in the thick brush that filled the ravine between the ridges. At first it sounded like nothing more than wind moving through the branches, but there was a rhythm to it that seemed somehow deliberate. I unslung my rifle and waited, every sense alert. The sound came again, clearer this time, and I realized it wasn't wind at all. It was breathing. Deep, labored breathing that seemed too loud and too slow to come from any animal I knew. The wet animal smell was stronger now, carried on the cold air like a physical presence. I stood frozen for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, trying to identify what I was hearing. Bear was still my best guess, but something about the rhythm and depth of the breathing didn't match my experience with the black bears common to the region. This sounded larger, more deliberate, somehow more aware. That's when the bushes began to move. It started as just a tremor in the vegetation, barely visible in my peripheral vision. But as I watched, the movement became more pronounced, as if something large was pushing through the undergrowth with purpose. The sound of breaking branches mixed with that labored breathing, creating a symphony of disturbance that seemed to fill the entire ravine. My training kicked in, and I brought the rifle to my shoulder, though I couldn't see anything clearly enough to take a shot. The movement was getting closer, and the smell was becoming almost overwhelming. Not just the wet animal odor now, but something else underneath it, something that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. Then, suddenly everything went quiet. The breathing stopped. The movement in the bushes ceased. Even the normal sounds of the forest, the occasional bird call, the rustle of small animals, vanished as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence was so complete and so sudden that it seemed unnatural, oppressive in a way that made me want to fill it with noise. I waited, rifle ready, scanning the ravine for any sign of movement. Minutes passed. My hands began to ache from gripping the rifle so tightly, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. The cold air burned my lungs as I finally allowed myself to breathe normally. Just as I was beginning to think whatever it was had moved on, I heard Vernon's voice calling my name from somewhere in the distance. But something about it didn't sound right. The voice was coming from the wrong direction, not from the canyon mouth where he should have been positioned, but from behind me, from the direction I'd come. And there was something else wrong with it. Something I couldn't quite identify. It sounded like Vernon, but also like someone doing an impression of Vernon, as if the words were being filtered through something that changed their quality. "Come over here," the voice called. "I need you here, now." The tone was urgent, almost demanding, and that was wrong too. Vernon had never spoken to me that way, never used that kind of authoritative bark. It was the voice of command, but coming from someone who had never needed to command me. I found myself taking a step toward the sound before I stopped myself. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct I had was telling me not to respond to that call. "What do you want?" I shouted back toward the voice, my words echoing off the rocky walls of the ravine and disappearing into the thick forest beyond. Silence. The response I expected. Vernon's familiar laugh, or perhaps an explanation of why he'd left his position, never came. Instead, the forest seemed to absorb my words like a hungry thing, leaving behind a quiet so profound it felt hostile. I stood there for several minutes, rifle raised, scanning the tree line where I thought the voice had originated. The shadows between the pines seemed to shift and move, but I couldn't tell if it was actual movement or just the way the filtered sunlight played tricks on my eyes. The wet animal smell was stronger now, mixing with something else, something that made my stomach turn with its suggestion of decay and wrongness. When the voice came again, it was different, closer, and definitely not Vernon. "Come here. Now," it said. And this time there was no mistaking the anger in it, the barely contained rage that transformed familiar syllables into something threatening. The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the forest itself was speaking. I took several steps backward, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Dad?" I called out, hoping against hope that this was all some kind of misunderstanding, that Vernon had somehow gotten turned around and was calling for help in a way I didn't recognize. But even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't him. The thing calling to me might have his voice or something like his voice, but it wasn't him. Vernon would never sound like that, never speak with that undertone of hunger and malice that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The smell hit me again, stronger this time, and I had to fight the urge to gag. It wasn't just the wet animal smell anymore, or even the suggestion of decay. This was the smell of death itself, of things that had been dead for a long time and were somehow still moving, still hunting, still hungry. I heard movement in the brush again, but this time it was deliberate, purposeful. Something was coming toward me through the undergrowth, pushing aside branches and small trees with casual strength. I could hear the steady rhythm of its approach, unhurried but relentless, like a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. That's when I saw it. What emerged from the thicket defied every natural law I thought I understood. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its body a grotesque parody of both human and animal forms. The head was the worst part, the skull of a massive elk, complete with a spread of antlers that must have measured 8 feet across, but where the eyes should have been were only dark, empty sockets that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The mouth was wrong in ways that hurt to look at. It could open far wider than any jaw should, revealing rows of teeth that belonged on a shark rather than any land animal. 2 enormous yellow fangs curved down from the upper jaw, stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify. The body was skeletal, covered in patches of rotting flesh and matted fur that hung in strips from the protruding bones. I could see through parts of its rib cage to the forest beyond, as if its torso was only partially solid. The arms were impossibly long, ending in hands tipped with black talons that looked sharp enough to slice through steel. But it was the legs that convinced me I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. They were the hind legs of an elk, but massive and wrong, ending in hooves that had been twisted into unnatural shapes. When it moved, those hooves struck the ground with the sound of hammer blows on stone. I raised my rifle and fired without conscious thought, the report echoing through the forest like thunder. The bullet struck center mass and I watched pieces of bone and flesh explode outward from the impact, but the thing didn't fall. It didn't even stagger. It turned those empty eye sockets toward me and tilted its head as if curious about this new development. I fired again, then a third time, each shot hitting home but having no visible effect beyond removing more chunks of already rotting flesh. Whatever this thing was, conventional weapons weren't going to stop it. It started moving toward me then, not running but walking with a deliberate pace that was somehow more terrifying than a charge would have been. I turned to run, but the rocky terrain and thick undergrowth made speed impossible. My backpack caught on branches and I could hear the thing behind me, its hooves striking the ground in a steady rhythm that never seemed to get closer or farther away. A sudden blow to my back sent me sprawling into a cluster of scrub oak. My rifle landed several feet away, and as I scrambled to reach it, I felt rather than saw the creature looming over me. The smell was overwhelming now, so strong it made my eyes water and my throat close up. I managed to get my hand on the rifle stock just as massive talons raked across my backpack, shredding the heavy canvas like tissue paper. I rolled away and came up with the weapon, but I'd already proven bullets were useless against this thing. That's when I remembered the Colt 45 on my hip. Was fumbling for the pistol when something large and heavy crashed into the creature from the side, sending both tumbling into the brush. The sound was incredible, like two freight trains colliding, mixed with roars and shrieks that seemed to come from some primordial nightmare. What had attacked the skull-headed creature was almost as impossible to believe as the creature itself. It stood over 8 feet tall and was covered in thick reddish-brown fur that caught the filtered sunlight like burnished copper. The build was unmistakably human in its basic structure, but enlarged and strengthened beyond anything that should have been possible. Massive shoulders, arms like tree trunks, hands that could palm a basketball like a golf ball. I realized I was looking at something that legends claimed didn't exist, something that countless witnesses had described and countless skeptics had dismissed. I was looking at what could only be called a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, one of those creatures that lived in the spaces between belief and disbelief, and it was fighting for its life against the skull-headed thing that had been hunting me. The battle was brutal and brief. The Sasquatch grabbed the elk skull creature by its bony shoulders and drove it backward into a massive pine tree, with enough force to shake snow from the upper branches. The skull thing tried to rake its talons across the Sasquatch's torso, but the thick fur and muscle seemed to turn aside the attack. I had my pistol out now, and I added my fire to the fight, emptying the magazine into the skull creature's torso and head. The heavy .45 slugs had more effect than the rifle bullets, staggering the thing and giving the Sasquatch the opening it needed. With a sound like a tree falling, the Sasquatch picked up the skull creature and literally threw it deeper into the forest. I heard the crash as it hit something solid, followed by a sound like breaking glass. Then suddenly the forest was quiet again. The Sasquatch turned to look at me, and for a moment we stared at each other across the space between species, between the known and unknown world. Its eyes were intelligent, aware, and somehow sad. It nodded once, a gesture so human it took my breath away, then turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees like smoke. I stood there for a long time, my empty pistol still in my hand, trying to process what I just witnessed. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Or was this some kind of hypothermia-induced hallucination? My mind creating impossible scenarios to explain what was probably nothing more than an encounter with a confused bear. But the shredded backpack was real. The empty magazines were real. And somewhere deep in the forest, something was moving through the trees with footsteps too heavy to ignore. I ran through the forest like a man pursued by his own shadow, leaping over fallen logs and crashing through undergrowth with complete disregard for stealth or safety. My only thought was to reach the canyon mouth where Vernon should be waiting, to find some kind of sanity in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Branches whipped across my face, leaving stinging welts, and more than once I nearly lost my footing on the loose stones and hidden roots that littered the forest floor. Behind me, I could hear nothing but the sound of my own labored breathing and the pounding of my heart, but I didn't dare slow down to listen more carefully. The terrain gradually began to look familiar as I approached the area where we'd planned to meet. The canyon opened up ahead of me, its walls catching and reflecting the pale December sunlight. I could see the clearing where we'd made camp the night before, the travel trailer looking impossibly small and vulnerable in the vast wilderness. I stumbled into the camp just as Vernon and Charles were returning from their positions. They looked up in surprise at my dramatic entrance, taking in my disheveled appearance and the obvious signs of panic written across my face. "Was that you shooting out there?" Vernon asked, his experienced hunter's eye already cataloging the details. My empty rifle, the shredded backpack, the way my hands were shaking as I tried to reload my pistol. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumbled rush that made little sense even to me. Skull-headed creature, impossibly tall, bullets passing through it like it was made of smoke. A Sasquatch appearing from nowhere to fight the thing that had been hunting me, the smell of death and decay that seemed to cling to my clothing even now. Vernon and Charles exchanged glances, and I saw something pass between them. Not mockery or disbelief, but a kind of cautious consideration that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd heard such a story. Charles walked over to examine my backpack, running his fingers along the parallel tiers that looked exactly like claw marks. "These are real," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades in the wilderness and knew the difference between normal predator sign and something else entirely. Vernon nodded slowly. "Something happened out there. Question is, what exactly?" I couldn't answer that. I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to answer that. The rational part of my mind was already working overtime, trying to construct explanations that would fit within the boundaries of the known world. Maybe it had been a bear, made to seem larger and more threatening by fear and adrenaline. Maybe the Sasquatch had been another hunter, someone wearing winter gear that distorted his appearance. Maybe the whole encounter had been a series of misunderstandings and misperceptions, amplified by isolation and stress. But the backpack told a different story. The claw marks were too precise, too deep, too perfectly spaced to have been made by any bear I'd ever heard of. And the smell, that awful combination of wet fur and rotting meat, still seemed to linger around me like an invisible cloud. That night, as we sat around the campfire, I found myself starting at every sound from the forest. The normal nighttime chorus of owls and small mammals seemed threatening now, each call potentially a signal or warning of something moving in the darkness beyond our ring of firelight. Vernon and Charles had insisted we maintain our normal routine, cooking dinner and sharing stories as if nothing had happened. But I could see the way they kept their rifles close at hand, and how they'd positioned themselves to have clear sight lines into the trees. They might not have believed everything I'd told them, but they weren't taking any chances. "You know," Charles said as we sat watching the flames dance, "there's been stories about this area for generations. The old-timers, the ones who logged these mountains back in the 30s and 40s, they had names for things that didn't fit into the normal world, called them different things. Windwalkers, bonefaces, the tall ones." Vernon nodded, stirring the fire with a long stick. "My father used to say there were places in these mountains where the rules were different. Places where you might see things that couldn't exist anywhere else." I wanted to ask more questions, but exhaustion was creeping over me like a heavy blanket. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the day's terror was finally wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made my eyelids feel like lead weights. But despite my exhaustion, I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see those empty eye sockets staring at me, could smell that awful odor of decay and wrongness. When I did manage to doze, my dreams were filled with the sound of hooves on stone and the sight of impossibly long arms reaching through the darkness. I must have gotten some rest, because I woke to the sound of Vernon moving around the trailer, starting the coffee and beginning the morning routine. Pale sunlight was filtering through the small windows, and the normal sounds of forest awakening helped to push back the shadows of the night before. But as I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the trailer's ceiling, I realized that something fundamental had changed. The world I'd known before yesterday, the world where impossible things stayed safely in the realm of stories and legends, was gone forever. In its place was a reality where the boundaries between the known and unknown were far more porous than I'd ever imagined. Against all logic and common sense, I found myself preparing to return to the site of the previous day's encounter. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about the stupidity of such a decision, but there was something driving me forward that was stronger than rational thought. I needed to know if what I'd experienced was real. Vernon and Charles tried to talk me out of it, pointing out the obvious risks and the fact that we'd already established the area was dangerous. But there was something in their eyes that suggested they understood my need for answers, even if they couldn't support my method of seeking them. Instead of my rifle, I carried my 12-gauge shotgun loaded with heavy slugs that would have enough stopping power to drop a charging bear. Or at least I hoped they would be effective against whatever I might encounter. I also packed a large basket and filled my backpack with supplies, jerky, bread, fruit, and even some candy bars I'd brought along for late-night snacks. The hike back to the encounter site took me through terrain that looked different in the morning light. Trees that had seemed threatening in the filtered twilight of the previous day now appeared normal, even friendly. The snow sparkled in the sunlight and the air was crisp and clean. carrying the healthy sense of pine and wood smoke from our distant camp. But as I approached the area where the encounter had taken place, the atmosphere began to change. The normal forest sounds, bird calls, the rustle of small animals, the whisper of wind through branches, gradually faded until I was walking through a bubble of unnatural silence. I found the site easily enough. The evidence of the previous day's violence was scattered across a wide area. Broken branches, torn undergrowth, and gouges in the earth that looked like they'd been made by something with claws the size of railroad spikes. In several places, the bark had been stripped from trees, revealing pale wood underneath that looked like exposed bone. But it was what I didn't find that was most significant. There was no blood, no scraps of fur or flesh, no physical evidence that any living creature had been injured in the battle I'd witnessed. It was as if the encounter had taken place in some parallel reality that intersected with our world just long enough to leave these minimal traces. Unpacked the supplies I'd brought and arranged them carefully in the basket, placing it on a flat boulder beside the small stream that ran through the area. The food looked absurdly domestic in this wild setting: store-bought bread and processed meat, fruits that had been grown in some distant orchard and shipped across the country to end up as an offering in a Colorado forest. As a finishing touch, I took off my New England Patriots baseball cap and placed it on top of the food. It was a gesture that felt both meaningful and ridiculous, a peace offering to something that might not even exist. "Thank you," I said aloud, the words seeming to echo strangely in the quiet air. I opened my arms wide in what I hoped was a universal gesture of gratitude and respect. I gathered my remaining gear and began walking back toward camp, but I'd gone no more than 30 yards when I heard the sound of something large moving through the trees behind me. I turned to look back and saw a massive pine tree, maybe 25 feet tall, swaying back and forth as if it were being shaken by hurricane-force winds. But there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. Something was using that tree as a way to communicate, or perhaps as a way to work off excess energy after the previous day's violence. I stood watching for several minutes, mesmerized by the sight of something so large and solid being manipulated like a reed in a storm. Curiosity overcame caution, and I found myself walking back toward the boulder where I'd left the offerings. The tree had stopped moving by the time I reached the site, but the basket was empty except for one item that definitely hadn't been there when I'd arranged the food. It was a tooth. A fang, actually, yellowed with age and easily 6 inches long. One of the teeth I'd seen in the mouth of the skull-headed creature the day before. It lay in the center of the empty basket like a calling card, proof that what I'd experienced hadn't been a hallucination or a case of mistaken identity. I picked up the fang with shaking hands, surprised by its weight and the way it seemed to radiate a cold that had nothing to do with the December air. The surface was covered with tiny scratches and what looked like bite marks, as if it had been worried and chewed by something with teeth of its own. As I stood there holding this impossible artifact, I heard movement in the forest around me. Not the aggressive crashing that had marked the skull creature's approach, but the careful, deliberate footsteps of something that was trying not to be seen. I caught glimpses of reddish-brown fur between the trees, never quite enough to make out details, but sufficient to confirm that my benefactor was still in the area. I carefully wrapped the fang in a spare sock and placed it in my pack, then gathered my gear and began the long walk back to camp. This time I didn't run. Whatever was watching me from the trees didn't feel threatening, and I had the sense that I was being escorted rather than stalked. The hike back gave me time to think about what had happened, and more importantly, what it meant. I'd entered the forest 2 days ago as a skeptic, someone who believed in the rational, explainable world of science and logic. I was leaving as something else entirely, a witness to mysteries that had no place in that rational world. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps there were corners of the world where different rules applied, where the impossible was not only possible but necessary, places where ancient things continued to exist, hidden from the modern world but still playing out their eternal dramas of survival and conflict. Vernon and Charles were waiting for me when I reached camp, their faces showing the relief of men who hadn't been entirely certain they'd see me again. I told them what I'd found, showing them the fang as proof that the previous day's events had been more than hallucination or misidentification. Charles examined the tooth with the professional interest of someone who'd spent years studying wildlife. But eventually, he just shook his head. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted. "It's not from any animal I know, but it's definitely real." Vernon was more philosophical. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained," he said, handing the fang back to me. "Maybe they're just meant to be experienced and remembered." The remainder of our hunting trip passed without incident, but the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. We went through the motions of our planned activities, checking equipment, scouting for sign, maintaining our camp. But there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. We all found ourselves listening more carefully to the sounds of the forest, watching the tree line with more attention than any normal hunting trip would warrant. On our final night, as we sat around the campfire preparing for the long drive home, Charles shared a story I'd never heard before. Years earlier, when he was still working as a forest ranger, he'd encountered a family of campers who'd fled their campsite in the middle of the night, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of equipment. They'd claimed something had circled their camp for hours, just outside the range of their flashlights, making sounds that were almost human but not quite. "I went up there the next morning to investigate," Charles said, poking at the fire with a long stick. "Found their camp exactly like they'd left it, but there were tracks around the perimeter. Big tracks bigger than any bear I'd ever seen and shaped wrong, more like a man's foot, but stretched out and deepened like whatever made them was carrying a lot more weight than any man should." Vernon nodded slowly. "There's been stories about these mountains for as long as people have been living here. The Navajo and Hopi tribes, they had names for things that lived in the high country. Most of the old-timers, the ones who logged and mined up here in the early days, they knew to stay away from certain areas." I asked why they'd never shared these stories before, and Vernon's answer was simple. Because most people aren't ready to hear them, and most people who do hear them aren't ready to believe them. The drive home the next morning was long and largely silent. Each mile of paved road we put between ourselves and the mountains seemed to return us to the ordinary world, the place where impossible things stayed safely in the realm of fiction and folklore. But I carried the fang with me, wrapped in that sock and tucked deep in my pack, physical proof that some impossible things were more real than the ordinary world wanted to admit. In the weeks that followed, I found myself changed in ways that were difficult to articulate. I was jumpier, more aware of shadows and unexpected sounds. I found myself reading everything I could find about cryptozoology, unexplained phenomena, and the kinds of encounters that most people dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications. But more than that, I found myself looking at the world differently. The boundaries between the known and unknown, between the possible and impossible, no longer seemed as clear-cut as they once had. There were places, I realized, where different rules applied. Places where ancient things continued to exist, hidden from the modern world but still real, still dangerous, still part of the larger mystery of existence. Helen noticed the change, of course. She'd known me long enough to recognize when something fundamental had shifted in my worldview. I told her parts of the story, the hunting trip, the encounter with what might have been a bear, the way the forest had seemed different and threatening. But I kept the deeper details to myself, along with the fang that I'd hidden away in a small box in the back of our bedroom closet. Some secrets are too big to share, even with the people you love most. Some experiences are so far outside the normal range of human understanding that they can only be carried alone, like a burden that can't be set down or passed to another person. Over the years, I found myself following stories about similar encounters, newspaper reports of strange sightings, usually buried in the back pages and treated as curiosities rather than serious news, television documentaries that promised to reveal the truth about creatures like Bigfoot and the Wendigo, though they never seemed to get closer to the real truth than sensationalized speculation. I began to understand that there was a whole community of people who'd had experiences like mine, witnesses to things that shouldn't exist, carriers of stories that couldn't be told in polite company. We recognized each other sometimes in the way we'd pause when certain topics came up in conversation, or the way we'd study tree lines and shadows with more attention than seemed warranted. But for the most part, we kept our secrets. We carried our impossible memories in silence, adding them to the vast collection of human experiences that exist outside the boundaries of what society is willing to acknowledge or accept. And now, 42 years later, I found myself faced with the decision of whether to pass that burden on to a new generation. My grandchildren sat around the fire, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fascination and skepticism that I'd probably worn at their age when listening to my own grandfather's stories about the old days. The flames danced and flickered, casting shifting shadows across their faces and making them look alternately older and younger than their years. Grace, my oldest grandchild, was trying to maintain her teenage skepticism, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into her expression. Tyler, still young enough to believe in monsters under the bed, was hanging on every word with the intensity of someone whose worldview was being fundamentally challenged. The other children, Emma, Brandon, little Chloe, sat in various stages of belief and disbelief, their young minds wrestling with the implications of what I was telling them. Behind me, I could feel Helen's hands tightening on my shoulders, her touch conveying both support and concern for the choice I was making. So yes, I concluded, my voice carrying across the fire-lit circle. I do believe that Wendigos exist, and I know that Sasquatch exists. I've seen them both, been helped by one and hunted by the other. I've got a tooth that shouldn't exist hidden away in our bedroom, proof of an encounter that most people would say was impossible. Grace leaned forward, her skepticism wavering. Can we see it? The tooth, I mean. I considered the question carefully. The fang had remained hidden for over 4 decades, seen only by Helen and myself. Bringing it out now would cross a line, would make this story something more than just words around a campfire. It would make it real in a way that couldn't be taken back. Maybe someday, I said finally. When you're older, when you've had time to think about what I've told you and decide what you believe. Tyler spoke up, his young voice serious in the way children's voices become when they're grappling with adult concepts. Were you scared, Grandpa? Terrified, I admitted without hesitation. More scared than I'd ever been before or have been since. There's something about encountering the impossible that strips away all your assumptions about how the world works. It leaves you naked and vulnerable in a way that's hard to describe. But you went back, Emma pointed out. You went back to leave food for the thing that saved you. I nodded. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the scary thing to do. That Sasquatch didn't have to help me. It could have let that other creature finish what it started, but it chose to intervene, to put itself at risk to save someone from another species entirely. That kind of sacrifice deserves recognition, even if it's never acknowledged. David leaned forward from his position at the edge of the circle. What do you think it means, Dad? The fact that these things exist? That they're still out there? It was a question I'd been asking myself for 42 years, and I still didn't have a complete answer. I think it means the world is bigger and stranger than we usually allow ourselves to believe. I think it means there are still mysteries out there, still places where the impossible is possible. Maybe that's important. Maybe we need to know that not everything can be explained or cataloged or reduced to data points. Helen's hands squeezed my shoulders, and I could hear the smile in her voice when she spoke. And maybe someone out there is going to capture footage of that Sasquatch someday, and he might just be wearing a Patriot's hat. The laughter that followed was gentle, affectionate, the kind of laughter that comes when a family shares a story that becomes part of their collective mythology. Whether they believed every detail or not, whether they thought I'd encountered genuine cryptids or simply misidentified known animals in a moment of stress and fear, the story had become part of who we were as a family. As the fire burned down and the evening began to wind toward bedtime, I found myself watching each of their faces, wondering how this story would affect them in the years to come. Would they find themselves looking at forests differently? Would they be more open to possibilities that existed outside the boundaries of conventional wisdom? Or would they file this away as just another family story, like the tales of great-grandfather's adventures in the war, or great-grandmother's recipes that had been passed down through generations? Time would tell. The stars were brilliant overhead, unpolluted by city lights and seeming close enough to touch. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, lonely and somehow comforting in its familiarity. The ordinary world was all around us, solid and reliable and governed by rules that made sense. But out there, in the places where humans rarely ventured, in the deep forests and remote mountains and forgotten corners of the wilderness, other rules might apply. Other possibilities might exist. Other stories might be waiting to be discovered by those brave enough or foolish enough to go looking for them. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. The fang yellowed with age and carrying the weight of 42 years of secrets. I held it up so the firelight caught its surface, showing the scratches and bite marks that told their own story of ancient conflicts and impossible encounters. "This is real," I said quietly, letting each of them see it before wrapping it up again and returning it to my pocket. "Whatever else you choose to believe about what I've told you tonight, this is real. The world is stranger than you know, and more wonderful than you can imagine." As we gathered up our chairs and began the process of banking the fire for the night, I caught sight of Grace watching me with new eyes. The certainty of teenage skepticism had been replaced by something more complex, not belief exactly, but an openness to possibilities she hadn't considered before. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was all any storyteller could hope for, not to convince, but to open minds to the possibility that the impossible might be possible after all. The fire settled into glowing coals, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out across the darkened valley. Tomorrow we would all return to our ordinary lives governed by ordinary rules and ordinary expectations. But tonight, for just a few hours, we had touched something larger and stranger than ourselves. We had shared a story that bridged the gap between the known and unknown, between the safe world of everyday experience and the dangerous realm of mystery and wonder. And in the telling of that story, we had become part of something larger, the ancient human tradition of passing on the impossible, the unexplained, the terrifying and wonderful truth that the world is far stranger than we usually dare to admit. The children would grow up carrying this story with them, and someday, when they were grandparents themselves, they might find themselves sitting around another fire, looking into young faces filled with curiosity and wonder, trying to decide whether to share the burden of impossible knowledge with another generation. And perhaps that's how these stories survive, not because they can be proven or disproven, but because they represent something essential about the human experience, our need to believe that mystery and wonder still exist in a world that often seems to have explained everything away. The fire was dying now, the last flames flickering and dancing in the cool night air. But the story would continue, passed from generation to generation, carrying with it the weight of experience and the promise that somewhere out there, in the forgotten places of the world, impossible things were still possible. And someday, someone might capture footage of a creature that shouldn't exist, moving through the forest with intelligence and purpose, wearing a small piece of human civilization on its massive head, a token of respect and gratitude, a bridge between worlds that logic says should never touch. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and eternal, witnesses to all the stories that had ever been told and all the mysteries that remained unsolved, and in their light anything seemed possible.